Welcome everybody to another episode of Dragonus Podcastus, and welcome to week 2 of our Oktoberfest special. I am your host, Deadponic, and with me is Queen Byron as always. Without her, none of this would be possible. If you guys like our show and want to support us, you can do so at patreon.com/Dragonus Podcastus. You can also support us on our Fiverr pages. I do weapons and armor work. Byron helps you actually run the game and use the software, and yeah, that's it. So, for week 2, I thought we'd take a bit of a detour in the opposite direction, um, and do have some cartoony villain fun. So, we're going to be talking about some evil artifacts, as opposed to every other time we've talked about artifacts, they've been usually associated with good. So, to really get to the heart about these evil artifacts and these evil beings, one has to understand the reasoning as to why they were created and how they function, as well as the horrible things they are capable of doing. So almost all of the artifacts that were forged they came from what is known as the Heart of Darkness. Now some have ties to Saragash, but most were created with either the powers of hell or some level of dark magic that makes Lord of the Rings dark sorcery look like a picnic. So, our first artifact is the Skull of Shadows. This little devil here is the entire reason for why the Dead Mountain is named such. The former men of this mountain were one of the main fighting forces against the Lich King of Agnos. But as a last proverbial middle finger to those men after they buried his body and all of his possessions in the fells of Ulbakesh, they didn't exercise his spirit. And so, that spirit effectively killed off all the men of the Mountain Kingdom and the surrounding cities and fortifications, thanks to a force that we will kind of get to later. But instead of their spirits passing on, he basically trapped them in the mountain, and he created the Skull of Shadows, which prevents them from actually leaving the mountain. And to make absolutely sure that they wouldn't try to find the skull, which was buried in a crypt on the far side of the mountain, the Lich King chained a Balrog to protect the bridge leading to the crypt. The only way to release those spirits is to destroy the skull. But to do that, you either need to destroy it with the holy powers of the Pope, or a high-ranking cleric, a paladin's blade that has been blessed specifically for this task, a red dragon's flame breath, or, just simply drop it into a volcano. But since the Lich King is still alive, if the skull was taken from the mountains, he would know right away. And, yeah, he's not exactly happy about that. So, yeah. Alright, so next up is, we have two. The Pariah of Silence and the Pariah of Despair. So these are they're basically obelisks, but usually you see like shards of them, and the shards are like a scaled down version of the powers that these hold. Both of them are designed specifically to deal with magic users. The Pariah of Silence completely shuts down magic users, and the Pariah of Despair is similar, but it deals with clerics, druids, bards, and paladins. It makes it so they can't use their powers. And if you combine a shard from each of the obelisks, you have a near perfect combination, which creates our next artifact, the Gauntlet of Endless Night. So when you combine the two shards, and you can put them into any specially made gauntlets, basically magic users cannot touch you in any capacity. Clerics and paladins can't use their powers on you, and you basically become a embodiment of fear and terror, which makes it perfect for an undead lord. In fact, it was these shards and this gauntlet that the Lich King of Agnos used in his war against the Free Peoples. But it merely amplified his powers to near god level status. It didn't do anything against magic users. The gauntlet, when combined with the two shards, can also create a zone of perfect darkness, which only purple and pure red flame can penetrate. Now, pure red flame is it can only be produced by a red dragon, and it has the ability to basically break darkness. And according to legend, it actually created the sun. So take that as you will. All right. Now, this one everybody should be familiar with, the Morgul Blade / Bolt. This one is kind of self-explanatory. It kills you and then turns you into a wraith. However, it's where you get stuck by a Morgul Blade or Bolt that matters. Because in the Lord of the Rings book, Frodo got stabbed in the shoulder, and there was still a shard from the Morgul Blade still stuck in there. So every year on the anniversary of being stabbed, he would fall ill. And hence, that was one of the reasons why he chose to leave Middle Earth for the Undying Lands. In this case, however, getting stabbed in the shoulder doesn't turn you. It's only if it hits your heart that it'll kill you and turn you. The turning effect is a long and very unpleasant process. It is also based on the intent behind the strike itself. If you just, simply stab the person with no intent of killing them or turning them, it just acts as a very potent poison blade. And the only way to deal with a Morgul blade is elven healing. Usually, the herb known as athelas, or kingsfoil as we mortals call it, actually slows down the poison considerably and can reverse some of the effects. There's specially treated plate armor that can stop it. And usually, having an iron will or being a Solaris Knight or sister usually works. Also, if someone who is aligned with good picks it up, the blade itself, not the entire weapon itself, it dissolves into ash, which leaves only a hilt. Which is why anybody who comes across a Morgul blade usually picks it up and wraps it in cloth. Alright, so next we have the Phobia Plate and Pauldron. So these two armor pieces basically enhance fear-based powers and provide protection against radiant and holy-based weapons. And all of the death rays are given these. Alright, so next up, we're going to cover evil beings. The first up are the Rinshi. The Rinshi are, they're one of the various soldiers under the One's command, who is my big, bad, evil guy. But what makes them different is that they wield shadow weapons, and that can punch through even Solaris Knight armor. And they also do this weird thing where they kind of stick their arms out and hop towards their enemy before engaging them. They're very strange in that way. Then you have the Shadow Knights. These guys are the elite bodyguards for the chairman of Char and are the only thing that scares Solaris Knights, reasonably. They are fast and they don't play nice. They have shields that are made of pure shadow that can actually break blades. They are 100% immune to paladin and clerical powers, so the only way to take them down is just to cut off their helm, since Shadow Knights are basically soldiers raised from the dead or transformed through necromancy. They feel no pain, they show no fear, and the only thing that tells you that these guys are Shadow Knights is the bright red eyes under their hoods and their helmets. And anybody who dares peek under those hoods will only see death incarnate and probably die because of the gaze of annihilation. Their weapons are forged from the shadow itself and can one-shot a party. Generally, it depends on what the party has going into the fight, which is why I don't usually use them in an encounter, because unless you are like max level, you will not survive an encounter with them unless they're like a brand new Shadow Knight. So our next guy is a guy named Gaboravim. Gaboravim was a Runian warrior who tragically died during the War of Agnos. Challenged by the Lich Lord of Agnos himself, he was struck with a Morgul blade and collapsed on the ground, and he died. However, because his spirit was pure, the transformation didn't have the intended effect. Instead, it turned him into a Shadow Knight, but he retained his humanity. And now his fate is tied to the Skull of Shadows as well. And so he wanders the world looking for this artifact so that he may finally be released into the afterlife. Along the way, he works as an anti-hero, helping people, not because it's the right thing to do, but because they may possibly have information leading to the skull. And yet there is no malice in his heart. Sure, he's cold and sometimes a little ruthless, but he doesn't kill for pleasure or for the sake of the kill. He also kind of has a weird soft spot for kittens and bunnies, and he'll go to like a sanctuary or a zoo and hang out with the animals. And yet, despite his intimidating exterior, the animals love him and they love being around him. And he basically will become very mad if anybody hurts the animals or kills them for any reason other than to provide for their family. So he's got a bit of a soft spot in that end. Okay, and then next we have Beljar the Mad. This is the only elf on this list, and he is the first of 12, and we'll come back to that later in a bit. Beljar was the former king of the Woodland Realm before he kicked off what became known as the Elven Civil War. He wanted to put high elves at the very top of the totem pole, and anyone else that wasn't a high elf went underneath, the lowest being the drow and the red elves. The wood elves rebelled against him, which led to Beljar ordering the slaughter of dozens of villages. The drow were spared this fate, thankfully, because of the Underdark, and the red elves took one look at this and basically bailed and heading for the human kingdoms. Beljar wanted to pursue them, but his advisors told him that doing so could kick off a war with the humans. But Beljar, being the intolerant little crapper that he is, ignored this and ordered his armies to march out of the woods in pursuit of the Red Elves. This act caused many of his top generals and members of his inner circle to conspire to assassinate him. They succeeded in what became known as the Heart of Blades plot, and Beljar's body was taken to Un and sealed in the mountain fells of Uk-Bakesh. However, this would not be the end of the tyrant, as a mysterious and evil force revived him and promised him the means to enact revenge against those who killed him. So next up we have the Lich King of Agnos, or the Witch King of Angmar if you want to draw comparisons. Now this guy, nobody knows who he is. All they know is he is evil and his cruelty and malice know no limit. He is also a very talented necromancer. He took over the tundra lands of Agnos and constructed a Dark Kingdom, to which he then waged war on the Free Peoples, to spread fear and despair across the lands of men, elves, and dwarves. And he created the most loyal of his minions, the Death Race. He was actually the one who created the Morgul Blades and used them to terrifying effect. However, it was at that moment that all the Free Peoples joined together and took a stand against Agnos. They journeyed across the sea and invaded his kingdom, and they succeeded in reducing his fortress to ruin and forcing him to flee until they finally cornered him and smote his ruin upon the plains. When he finally fell, the men of the mountain took his body and all of his possessions and sealed it in Uk-Bakesh. Deep within the mountain they buried him, in a tomb so dark that it could never touch light. The Lord of Agnos escaped thanks to a disillusioned sorcerer who not only revived him, but actually bound the Lich King to his service, becoming an extension of the sorcerer's will, and he acts as the supreme commander of his Uruk forces as he plans to march across the sea and wage war once again. So, then we have, finally we have Ra, the Silver Viper. So, he was formerly known as Mayhill, and he was the student of Fern, the Black Viper, but he didn't start out as a ninja of Char. He was an urchin living in the streets, having to steal food to survive and pickpocket money just to live, and he lived in a rundown building. Cough, cough, Aladdin. Fern saw him and took pity on him, and as we discussed in the Fern episode, he was taught the way of the sword. And this was when one of the Charian Inquisitors took Mael away to the Spire. Now, no one knows what was done to Mael, but when he emerged from that damn place, he was different, and not in a good way. And the big twist is that when Fern was riding his horse into Char, it turns out that he had been marked by a mage, and that was how they were able to track him. And the little snotrig that killed his wife and child and horse, it wasn't the kid. It was Ra. Dun dun dun! And so, he was disguised as the noble's son, and the noble's son was working out a deal with an arms dealer at the time, and his father was the victim of a classic political maneuver. And the best part is when Fern finds out the truth, he's gonna go absolutely bananas and resort to being the monster again. And everyone running Char is going to learn the real definition of what a living nightmare is. Alright, So yeah, that's everybody that I got on my list here. Before we wrap up, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to have a whole list of, evil artifacts and their effects. That's a really fun thing to do for a world building perspective, definitely.
Well, I was gonna go on a bit of a tangent about comparing Beljar where he is on the intolerance and the POS scale.
Mm.
So just going off on a bit of a tangent here. So at the top of the at 10 being the most intolerant POS that you can think of, you have the Imperium of Man from Warhammer. Then you have the episode called Trock from Teen Titans. Then you have Beljar the Mad. And it's it's a little hard to describe without going into further details of the Elven Civil War, but all these guys have something in common where they were basically born out of the shadows, or they malice and cruelty. They basically, it grew in their hearts, and they kind of went bananas and decided, you know what, I'm going to spread fear and terror across the land and spread the evil will of evil. And yeah, and to quote a movie here, evil will always triumph because good is dumb. Yeah, and that is
All right.
semi true though. Anyway, so yeah, that's our episode, but next week's gonna be another undead themed episode. But yeah, we'll see you guys next time.